The topic that's given to us at this 118th birth anniversary of Dr. N.M. Pereira is towards an agenda for deep democratic reform. I'm deeply honored to have been invited to speak on this occasion. I remember 13 years ago on his 105th birth anniversary, I addressed a similar meeting that was conducted by the Lanka Samaja Party. But here we have a few radicals out of the Lanka Samaja Party conducting this event. I must say the topic that has been chosen is very appropriate for us today. Why do I say that? Why do we need reform and deep democratic reform at that? We need reform, we need democratic reform, we need deep democratic reform because we now live in a failed state. That is why we need to first understand and accept the fact that we are living in a failed state. Most people in this country fight shy of conceding to the fact that this is a failed state. But that's a fact. It's a fact that since independence, or perhaps even a couple of decades before independence onwards, we've gone on a path that has brought us to where we are today. And that's a failure. I want to address this issue in two broad compartments. Each of those also has two sections. Firstly, political. And under political, the governance issue as well as ethnic or group relations. Secondly, economic. And under economic section, I want to deal with the structural economic economic structures that we have and the pervasive culture of corruption in the country. Now, broad categorization like this perhaps gives an idea of what I want to address as the causes for the deep crisis that the country is in. Dr. N.M. Pereira in the 1930s, when Lanka Samaja Party was first formed, the first political party in Sri Lanka, he and his comrades articulated the vision for a new country that can govern itself and the kind of political behavior, the political structures that must be put in place and the economic order of that new country. He was the first leader of the opposition and as many people have said, was the best prime minister that Ceylon or Sri Lanka never had. Now, the theories that were advocated at that time, that were articulated, that were propounded, were ideal. And if those had been followed, I dare say we will not be in the crisis that we have today, either political or economic. But that was not to be. And even if on an occasion such as this, commemorating his birth anniversary, I think it is not inappropriate for me to say that even he failed. Even he failed in putting into practice or setting the agenda as the topic today contemplates, the very theories that he and his comrades propounded. Particularly flagged the United Front government of 1970 to 1977 and their participation in that government, which led the way for a deep division in the country between the ethnic communities. Those in the 1950s, mid-1950s, on principle said if you have, that was Dr. Colin de Silva, nevertheless, Lanka Samasamajis, who said if you have two languages, you will have one country, but if you have one language, you will have two countries. Alas, when they were in government and made the first so-called autochthonous republican constitution for the country, constitutionalized one language as the official language for the country and gave Buddhism the foremost place for the first time. So that was a great failure in not converting the theories into practice, even when they held the whip in their hand. I say so because stalwarts like Dr. N.M. Pereira and Dr. Colin de Silva, Peter Kenneman, in the cabinet of Mrs. Srimawada Bandaranaike were heavyweights, and so much of social legislation was made during that time. They had their way in many ways, but they failed in this. Deep democratic reform. You see, democracy has a very simple way of being explained as the rule of the majority. But that's a very simplistic way in which democracy can be misrepresented, because there is a very thin line or no line at all between rule of the majority and majoritarianism. Sometimes you don't realize that what is being practiced is actually majoritarianism and not rule of the majority in that sense. I think in the political side, that's what happened, particularly when the first Republican Constitution was made, when continuous calls were made that for democracy to be alive, to be active, to be meaningful, numerically smaller communities also must have their space within the larger polity, was ignored. Ignored is a very soft term to describe what actually happened. You took a vote in the Constituent Assembly on the basic resolutions. Just took a vote, 114 to 18, 118 to 16. Took a vote, and not 114, sorry, 86 to 16. That was the count of the kind of count on the basic resolution in the 80s and 14, 16, and so on. So preponderant majority. Therefore, that was right. But that was not right. That's what led to a severe breakdown, the effects of which we are still living with, and the cure for which we still haven't found, or we still are, the cure, all of us know what the cure is, but still are unable to face up to that and make that reform. The people in their own localities must have a say in how governance happens in those areas. People with different cultural, linguistic, religious, social backgrounds must, even in their own conclaves, be able to exercise those and flourish without it being commandeered into a larger space and snuffed out. Now the effect of that was a 3-decade-old actual armed conflict. But even today, we don't quite realize that the conflict remains. It's only the armed struggle, that one armed struggle, that has been put down. How this conflict will manifest in the future, we all seem oblivious to. Quite happy to exercise our majority vote in everything. Now, that calls for a deep democratic reform. That thinking ought to change. Numbers do matter in final decision making, but before you take the vote, every view, every legitimate expression must be taken into account. Not merely saying, okay, you have your say, we'll have our way. No. We'll let you have your say, but we will have our way. No, that's not what is contemplated. You give due consideration for that say, for that view. Even if one person out of 100 says something, you give it, you take that into account. You create space for that expression. That is democracy. Democracy primarily must not just a vote taking, which is a final and last event in a long agenda, but debate and deliberation are absolutely crucial in a democracy. And why do you have debate and deliberation? You have debate and deliberation so that people can change their mind, that you must have an open mind. You don't engage in debate thinking, oh, let's debate it, but we know how we are going to vote at the end. That's not democracy. That culture must change. And we have not changed. We haven't changed. That political structure hasn't changed. And therefore, the ethnic or social relations in the country are still strained, very much strained. And the country will not reform. We will not have a workable democracy, or we will even not have a country to call our own if we don't address that deep issue. The economic structures, on the other hand, we all pay lip service, but still, what do we have today? From the time we gained independence to now, hasn't the gap between the haves and the have-nots increased? It has, or if it hasn't, how it hasn't happened is because they have not had to leave the country, seek employment in the Middle East or elsewhere or in Europe, or migrate and then remit money. The structure here hasn't paved the way for a socialist order, for an order in which people are equal. I mean, when I say equal, you will never achieve the utopian model, but you proceed in that direction, you keep advancing towards that. But that hasn't happened. The opposite has happened. And now, because we are in an economic crisis, quote unquote, we've gone to the IMF, and I must say, more than 2 years ago, all of us said we need to take drastic steps. Last January, 2022 January, several party leaders in parliament gathered together, and about 12 of them signed a document which we submitted to the government and said, go to the IMF. There is no other way. That was not a choice. That was not a choice. We had no other choice but to go there. But in that very document, we underlined the fact that whatever IMF program that's put in place must protect the poor, must protect the vulnerable, and that any negotiation with the IMF must ensure that people who are already in the doldrums, people who have already had to sacrifice one meal and about to sacrifice 2 meals a day, don't go without food. Unfortunately, we have got into a program today, and I am saying this responsibly, having attempted many times to engage with IMF officials, engage with government officials, having put forward alternate methods of increasing revenue, and having failed in all of those attempts. And that's why I'm publicly saying that the program that we seem to have got into with the IMF is absolutely disastrous to the country. There is no thought at all about the vulnerable sections in our society in this IMF program. There is some thought in the sense that unlike earlier years, the IMF now pays lip service to these issues. Earlier they did not do that, but now they keep saying these things. But it's mere lip service. To that extent they have thought about it, how to write that. But in the program, there is nothing to protect the vulnerable sections of our society. The working class, whose decades-old savings are going to be devalued in a most drastic manner. Prices increase, school children starving almost, and we've seen these in our villages already. One good example is the electricity tariff hike. I want to just mention that example so that it sort of explains. The country produces electricity through different means. One is hydroelectricity. That costs the country the lowest. The country also produces electricity through fossil fuel, say diesel. The gap between the cost of electricity produced through hydropower and by diesel is enormous. It's about 12 times, 11 or 12 times more. Now we have bands. We have 0 to 30 units, 30 to 60 units, 60 to 90 units, 90 to 120 units and so on of consumption, and different rates for those consumptions. Now, if all of the household, I'm only talking about domestic consumption, if all of the households in Sri Lanka consumed less than 60 units, almost 90% of that, or more than 90% of that, can be met with only electricity produced by hydropower. That costs very little. So why is electricity cost high? It's only because of people who use more than 60 units, more than 90 units, more than 100 units. Simple arithmetic. Sorry, Dr. Kumar. So, but how have the tariff increase happened now? 0 to 30 is 275% increase. 30 to 60 is 175%, or no, 200 and something increase. 60 to 90 is 175% increase. Beyond a particular slab, no increase at all. Now how is that? How is that just? Now this has been brought to the notice of the IMF. They wouldn't look at it. No, we have done our calculation. No, we don't agree with you. That's all. So something that can be demonstrated by simple arithmetic, they are refusing to look at. So many other things. You see, they have two phrases that they are using now. One is corruption susceptibilities, and that's my last point. We'll deal with that. Other is governance diagnostic. Whatever those mean, they only mean something that they say in those phrases and nothing more. You talk about governance matters. No, we can't get into that. We don't get into political issues. You know, democracy is about elections. Elections are put off. Periodic elections are a must. That's not all, but that must happen. But that has nothing to do with governance for the IMF. They turn a blind eye to that. Corruption, well, they are happy if you pass some laws. People are not thriving in corruption because of lack of laws in this country. We have enough laws. It's a will to implement those laws. I'm not sure if I'm right when I say that no politician in this country has been convicted for corruption. I mean, at election time, election petitions do say some people have been, unseated for treating and so on and so forth. But while in office, being involved in corrupt deals, has any politician ever been convicted? No. Why? Because there is an unwritten code between the two main parties. When I say parties change names, but you have two blocks. That when we are in the opposition, we will charge you with corruption, but we won't do anything to you. And you do likewise when it changes. That's an unwritten code that they hold on to and they implement. That is why when corruption is such a huge issue at all levels of society. Now, I am not only dealing with the politicians here, I am dealing with all of us. The one who gives a bribe is as much to blame as the one who takes a bribe. And the private sector in this country is more to blame than the government sector in that respect. So where do we start? Where do we start this deep democratic reform? We thought we had it last year around this time, because something unconventional happened. The people of the country rose up, not through proper structural sort of ways, but on their own. And they achieved something which couldn't have been achieved in any other way, of ousting an executive president. But that's all they did, and that's all they were able to do. President Ranil Wickremesinghe, who was supportive of that Aragale up to a particular date, says, until that date I was supportive of that, but after that it was hijacked. Therefore I am not supportive. So he says somebody else hijacked it. I have said this in Parliament, I am saying this again today. The one who hijacked the Aragale is President Ranil Wickremesinghe and no one else. He hijacked it, he became the executive president and snuffed out any positive movement that the Aragale started. But we need that radical reform, and at various meetings I have been saying we need a radical alternative. We need to get out of our habitual thinking. We need to move, as they say, get out of the box, like the people did last year. I mean, there was no formal arrangement as to how people can protest and chase an executive president out of the country. No. We need unconventional methods, radical thinking, if we are to save this country from total disaster. Thank you.